Hey, what's up, Preteen? I'm so excited that you guys are here joining us today. We're going to be continuing in our summer series called Focus. This is all about faith, and I can't wait to continue talking about faith with you guys today. But before we get started, grab your mom, dad, brother, sister, friend, pet, whoever may happen to be at your house, get close to the screen, and let's get ready to worship together. It's going to be an awesome service, and I'm so glad that you guys are joining us online.
Salvation sounds a new beginning as distant hearts begin believing. Redemption's bid is unrelenting. Your love goes on. Your love goes on. When the world gives way, carry us with your endless grace. Carry us.
Awesome. All right. That was so awesome. I'm so glad that you guys had a ton of fun worshiping. I definitely did. Me and my wife, we were dancing in front of the TV. You know, it's a lot of fun. I'm so glad. But today, like I said earlier, we're going to be continuing in our series called Focus. Today, we're going to be jumping back to the New Testament. We're going to be talking about Paul all over again, and I'm so excited for that. But before we get into it, I have a little story I want to tell you guys. In your life, have you ever had something that seems just a little bit off or backwards? This was definitely the case for me when I was 17. I had just started to drive a few months before, and I was just getting used to the road and everything with it. The way that you sit on the driver's side and somebody else is in the passenger side. We all drive on the right side of the road. That's a very common thing that you would feel like isn't too hard to get a grasp of. But when I was 17, I went on a mission trip with my high school ministry to Malawi, Africa. And after all these long flights, this very long trip to another country, we landed after over a day of flying. And when I got there, I saw my pastor, and instead of hopping into what I thought would have been the passenger side of the car, he hopped into the driver's side of the car. And I knew that he had never been there before either. He was just like me, very first time in Africa. There was no way that he was driving us to where we were going. It wasn't possible. We were going to a village. There was no way that he was driving the car. And so we all got into the car, and sure enough, even though he got into what I thought was the driver's side, it was the passenger side. And that seemed a little bit off to me. It seemed a little backwards. And I didn't know what was going on. And then we pulled out onto the road, and instead of pulling onto the right side of the road, we pulled into the left side of the road, which was also completely backwards. And for me, I felt like we should have been pulling into oncoming traffic. But the reality was we were just driving with the flow of traffic. We were going the right way. The car's layout, as I started to look into other cars, was just the same as ours. It wasn't weird. That was how they did it there. And what a lot of you probably don't know, what I definitely didn't know until this moment, was that everyone else does cars backwards from us. They do driving backwards from us. We sit on one side that we call the driver's side, and we drive on the right side of the road. But everywhere else, the driver's side is on the opposite side, and they drive on the left side of the road. So for me, being all jet lagged and not knowing exactly what was going on, this seemed very off and backwards. And for you, I'm sure it would have seemed off and backwards if this happened to you. If your parents just decided to drive tomorrow and they pulled onto the other side of the road from where you normally drive, you would probably be panicking and freaking out. And as a 17-year-old, that's definitely what I was doing. But sometimes I wonder if we look at God that way. If there are some things that we believe about God, there are some things that we see that are just off or backwards. It's definitely possible. And actually, we see this a couple different times in the Bible. Today, we're going to be taking a very specific look at one of these situations. If you guys will remember, not too long ago, we talked about Paul. Last week, we were in the Old Testament, but this week, we're going to be taking another jump back into the New Testament and joining up with Paul in the book of Acts all over again. So let me just tell you guys, Paul was on this trip. He was all over the world. He was meeting different people. He was growing. He was planning churches and handing them off to other people. And at this particular trip, he had left the country he was in and was going to wait to meet up with some friends. And he was in a city called Athens. Does anybody know where Athens is? If you want, you can pause the TV right now and you can ask your parents where Athens is, because I'm sure that they'll know. Or maybe if you want to take a guess, they can let you know and you can find out in about 3 seconds, because Athens is a city in Greece. Greece was very different at the time. It was still a part of the Roman Empire, just like Paul and the places that he had come from and been to were, but it was a lot different than them in this sense. You see, in the Old Testament, it makes it very clear that we are called to follow one God, the one true God. You see, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, in the 10 Commandments, it says this: "Do not put any other gods before me." Following one God is pretty central to our lives as Christians. It's not anything that's up for debate, up for question. I'm not like, hey, I believe that Jesus came and died for me, but I also believe in this God over here. That's just not something that we do today. But you see, Greece was a little bit different. Greece didn't know where everything had come from, and they wanted to credit things to people. They wanted to thank the gods who had given them what they got. And so instead of believing that there was one God who created the entire world and gave us everything that we have, they believed in multiple gods. So when the sun came up in the morning, they wanted to thank God. And they didn't know who exactly to thank because they didn't know what God had created it. So they created a sun god, and they would say thank you to the god of the sun. When they were going on long journeys on boats and traveling across the world, they didn't know who to thank for letting them get there safely. So they would thank the ocean god who they created. Then if they had a really good season of harvest, they would thank the farming god. Or if they had a very bad season of harvest, they would try to make amends with the farming god. They believed things completely differently than how we do today. And that's one big thing, is that Paul realized that these people were nothing like us. They didn't believe the same things. He would roam around the city and see statues and temples to worship these gods who were a big part of the different things in the Greek culture. But he knew the truth. He knew that Jesus had come to die for us and that there was one true God. And eventually Paul stumbled across a statue of an unknown God. And this was true because not only did they worship people for all sorts of different things, from the sun rising to safe travels, but they wanted to make sure that they didn't leave out a god, because maybe that would upset that god. So they had statues to unknown gods to make sure that they didn't upset them. And that's where we're going to pick up here. Paul ends up in Athens waiting for his friends. Paul was waiting for Silas and Timothy in Athens. He was very upset to see that the city was full of statues of gods, just like we were talking about. So we're going to pick up in Acts chapter 17, verse 17, when it says this. So he went to the synagogue and talked to both Greeks and Jews who worshiped God. So one thing that's really, really simple to think about this is that Paul was going to talk to people who were like him. He was seeing people who believed what he believed, who saw what he saw, and knew that there was one God and one God alone who had sent his son to come and save us. But this is the thing, is you might think it's simple, it makes sense. Paul is talking to people who are just like him, but that's not true. As this verse continues, we're going to find every day he spoke to people who happened to be in the marketplace. So one thing that you'll notice is that it talks about the marketplace in this story. And the marketplace was kind of like a hybrid between the grocery store and the mall. How we might go to shop for clothes at the mall or fruit at Walmart, we might go find all those things at all these different places. But the marketplace was kind of one solid place where you could always count on finding something. So as you could tell, a lot of people went to the marketplace. There was nobody who was just absent from the marketplace. Everyone needed to go there for one reason or another, whether it was social, they just wanted to go look for clothes or something, or they needed to go get food. So everybody in this town would go to the marketplace. And so Paul spent a lot of time there trying to talk to people and teach them about Jesus. And that was his primary goal. In verse 18, it says this: a group of Epicurean and Stoic thinkers began to argue with him. Some of them asked, "What is this fellow chattering about?" Others said, "He seems to be telling us about gods we've never heard of." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus. He was telling them that Jesus had risen from the dead. And we'll pick up in verse 18 when it says this. A group of Epicurean and Stoic thinkers began to argue with him. Some of them asked, "What is this fellow chattering about?" Others said, "He seems to be telling us about gods we've never heard of." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus. He was telling them that Jesus had risen from the dead. You see, these people were really, really smart people. They were big thinkers, and they were so interested that Paul was telling them about a God that they had never heard of that they decided to take him to people who were on the next level from them, another level of thinkers up. And so this is what happens as we'll continue in verses 19 and 20. They took him to a meeting of the Areopagus. There they said to him, "What is the new teaching you're giving us? You have some strange ideas we've never heard of before. We would like to know what they mean." Now, this is pretty great. They basically invited Paul to tell them the good news about Jesus and tell them why he thought what they believed was wrong. And this is something that you might not see very often, is Paul was given a very unique opportunity to show them what was off or backwards about what they believed. So we're going to continue in verses 22. Then Paul stood up in the middle of the Areopagus. He said to them, People of Athens, I see that you are religious in every way. What Paul meant was he was talking about these statues that he saw and the ways that these people would like to worship. And he'll continue on to that train of thought in verse 23 when he says, "As I walked around, I looked carefully at the things you worship. I even found an altar to an unknown God written on it. So you don't know who you are worshiping." A statue to an unknown God. See, this is just like what we talked about earlier. Paul found this statue to an unknown God, and it was just because they didn't want to leave a God out. They didn't want to leave someone who had created something for them out. They didn't know what this God had created or who he was, but they were wanting to be sure that they didn't leave him out. But Paul would essentially go on to define this God as our God, the one true God, Jesus. And that's where we're going to pick up in verses 24 and 25 when it says this. "He is the God who made the world. He also made everything in it. He is the Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in temples built by human hands. He is not served by human hands. He does not need anything. Instead, he himself gives life and breath to all people. He also gives them everything they have." What an introduction Paul just made for Jesus. He just told them all about his God, the God that he believes in, the God that sent his one and only son. That this was a God greater than something they could build a statue or a temple for. This was a God who he himself created everything, from the world to us, and he ruled over the heavens and the earth. This is a really, really big deal. But as we'll continue on, Paul will continue to tell them and make this argument for God. And as he goes on, he'll begin to tell them about Jesus and how he rose from the dead. And this gets a little bit weird for them. For some of them, it's actually too much. Because in verse 32, it'll pick up and say this. "They heard Paul talk about the dead being raised. Some of them made fun of this idea, but others said, 'We want to hear you speak about this again.'" Not only did they want to hear him speak more, some of these people wanted to give their lives to Christ right then and there. They believed him. They knew that what he was saying was true. And these people converted and followed Paul. This was a really, really powerful speech that changed the lives of several people. Other people wanted to hear about it again. Some people laughed at him, but that's okay, because Paul continued to teach the word of Jesus. One of the things that I think is really cool and I love about this story is that Paul used the things that were available to him. He saw their statues in their temples and he used those things to teach them about Jesus. See, you're going to see some stuff like that in your life. Maybe it's a sport that you play. For me, I played basketball, and maybe you can use something about that sport or about a play that you're in or a class that you took to help teach people more about Jesus. Before we wrap up today, I want to leave you guys with this key question, and that is, how can you help others know Jesus? In your life, you're going to run into a bunch of people who need to learn in different ways. And so I'm going to encourage you guys to think about how you can help others know Jesus. And that might be using the things around you, using something that you do, but I really just want to encourage you guys to help others know Jesus. Before we wrap up, I'm going to pray for you guys. God, thank you so much for everything that you do for us. Thank you for all of the Rock Point kids who are tuning in to watch this week's Preteen service. We're so glad that they could tune in and be a part of this, God. We're so thankful for everything that you're doing and the way that you're allowing us to continue to gather online. We pray that we're all back together again soon, but in your own timing. We love you so much, God. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Awesome. I hope you guys all have a great week, and we'll see you back next week.